Now, if we study this topic as a similar format that we've studied every other topic, what we can see is that there is an actual unfolding process that happens for gender development. So in childhood, as we mentioned earlier, what we see is that the gender identification and gender separation starts usually in the early years of a child's life. It's not necessarily in infant years, but in the early childhood of years, maybe in preschool or elementary school, if children were kind of homeschooled, maybe a little bit later than that. But whatever it is, usually in childhood, we already start to see this gender separation starting. What we also have recognized in research studies, though, is that this gender separation seems to be very, very pushed upon boys more than it is for girls. There's much more acceptance of what we call tomboys, much more acceptance of girls not necessarily following all the gender norms when they're at a young age, and very little tolerance for boys that deviate from this practice. Now, their family members might be more accepting, and in fact, we're reaching a culture nowadays where it is common for many family members to be significantly more accepting of boys that don't necessarily abide by the gender norms that they're typically kind of encouraged to abide by. But society does not necessarily make it easy on these children. Many people outside of the family, or many even kind of less close family members, still often respond hostilely or just uncomfortably to boys that tend to kind of deviate from the standard behaviors that we link within a specific gender. This is true for most cultures, but there are cultures that don't necessarily follow this very kind of male specific treatment that we see within our culture and many other Western and even Eastern cultures with respect to kind of the early separation of gender in kids. Once we get into adolescence, once those hormones kick in, one thing that we've recognized is that gender roles, even though they're recognized in gender norms and gender types, not only are they kind of re-picked up in adolescence, but they tend to be intensified. And this relates to something that we call the gender intensification hypothesis. This is based on this notion that once gender starts to become very prominent, once boys and girls start not only developing kind of the recognition that one's a boy and one's a girl, but they start developing those sex characteristics that make it very obvious as to which gender somebody is, many kids who might have been able to straddle the kind of middle ground between specific genders are often pushed to really abide by one specific gender, to follow a specific gender norm. And this is where really the ultra masculine and ultra feminine behavior starts to merge in many males and females. Now, again, there's always people that don't necessarily follow these trends, but statistically, we see adolescence is a real critical time for a lot of children to kind of not only push themselves to kind of only hang out with people of their gender, but more importantly, to really abide by the gender standards that are set by our culture. And we think this is partially related to hormones, but more importantly, it's a product of kind of the social environment and the recognition of gender really becoming something that has to be kind of identified by these children. When we get to adulthood, we see again a continued separation of genders. But one thing that's really interesting that we started to find over the last couple of years is that there is an easing or relaxation of these gender standards on males once they get into later adulthood. And in fact, many males who have lived their entire lives kind of being pushed to be more masculine, they're actually encouraged by society to kind of let down those masculine rules, let down the I guess masculine barriers that they've created, and adopt more feminine mentalities, to be more nurturing, to be more caring. And many males, as they get into their later adulthood years, we're talking 40s, 50s, maybe even 60s, often kind of embrace this option, and their behaviors do start to become significantly more what we would call feminine. We don't see these same shifts in females. We don't see them becoming exceptionally masculine as they get older, and we're not quite sure why this is the case. We don't know if it's being discouraged in females for them to be more masculine, if there's something that's relating to cohort effects that's causing these differences, but right now our studies have indicated that males do become significantly more feminine in their older years, and females tend to stay at their same feminine levels without adopting many masculine characteristics. So when we look at this idea, what we see again is that gender development, the changes that happen, occur not only in childhood, but all the way throughout our entire lifespan. Um, One of the things that you might have heard of when we're talking about gender differences before you got into this class is the notion that masculine things and feminine things are very, very different across a number of different categories. In particular, one of the things that people have argued really separates out the gender is cognitive abilities. And this is something that many psychologists have actually taken cause with over the years. There are many, many studies that have shown that there's differences in verbal skills, emotional skills, visual spatial skills, aggressiveness, many other categories like mate selection or scholastic ability. But what we've seen statistically over the years is that these trends are often way, way overblown in comparison to what we actually see. And it is true that statistically males do score slightly higher in visual spatial skills than females, but if you look at the picture to the right, what you see is an actual representation of the populations that we see with respect to these visual spatial skills. And what you often see in these things is that there tends to be kind of a slightly higher bump in a very, very small percentage of males, usually in the extreme forms with visual spatial skills, that causes the male average to be slightly higher than the female average in this. But statistically, the average female is almost as good as the average male in visual spatial skills, and the only differences that you see usually across the environment are fairly mild. And the same thing goes for things like verbal skills or emotional skills / empathy. In fact, there's a lot of research that's started to question whether or not there is even any difference in emotional skills between men and women. Aggressiveness is something that we see big gender differences in if we define aggressiveness as physical aggressiveness, but again, if we go in all forms of aggressiveness, there's a very mild difference in aggressive tendencies between men and women if you look at a variety of different types of aggressiveness and you study large samples of individuals. It's usually just those rare males that are extremely aggressive that tend to kind of pull up the average for males that causes this perception of great differences. And this is something that can really be highlighted in one of the first differences that many psychologists thought was actually there, the big difference between men and women, and that's in scholastic ability. If we look at the past, what we saw was abundant research suggesting that women were completely incompetent. In the early 1900s, a lot of the studies argued that women just couldn't possibly succeed in school because they had smaller brains, because they couldn't process things, because they had all these things wrong with them. Nowadays, 100 years later, research is starting to suggest the exact opposite, that boys are completely incapable of succeeding in school because they can't regulate their emotions, because they can't interact with people successfully. When we look at these kind of weird clashing ideas, we get a sense of is that a lot of the gender differences might indeed simply be a product of the social environment, some of the norms that are out there. So boys are kind of encouraged to play video games more, encouraged to interact with people, encouraged to use their visual spatial skills more often than females. Then there might be a small number of boys that have that uptick in visual spatial abilities compared to females. But if we kind of control for all of those things, there's a lot of psychologists that believe that a lot of these differences that we see on the surface might just simply be a product of the social environment and kind of a relic of whatever the culture is kind of pushing boys and girls to do. Essentially, by adopting the gender norms, these emergences might happen, even though naturally these things might not have to actually happen. There's a lot of skepticism about this. There's a lot of uncertainty about these ideas, but this is one of the directions that many people are starting to kind of lean towards when we talk about some of the cognitive and emotional differences that we see between men and women just naturally. Of course, when we talk about gender differences, one of the big areas that's kind of gained a lot of extra attention over the last few years is in the differences of sex, in particular sexual activity, sexual preferences, sexual association, And what we see statistically is that a lot of, just like we saw in the last one, differences between the genders tend to have been overblown. So what we see is that the sexual activity and sexual frequency differences between males and women, though existent, uh, is fairly minor. Sexual frequency in terms of married men and women and non-married men and women are fairly similar. And if you look at the chart to the right of us, the survey that was done just a few years back, and the frequency of kind of non-sexual activity, masturbation, is also fairly similar between the two genders, even though there's kind of a misnomer as to how often these things happen. Homosexual activity, again, is something where there's this perception that many males are engaging in homosexual activity and very few females are, but statistically we don't see dramatic differences. Now there's a lot of studies out there that kind of give us different numbers for the percentage of homosexual individuals across males and females in our culture, but some of the more recent studies, one of the kind of I guess best estimates of homosexual activity was one study that was done in 1994 by a researcher named Michael, and what he found was that about 3% of males, actually, sorry, I think it was she, either way, about 3% of males, or 2.7% of males, reported a homosexual activity or a homosexual encounter within the past year. About 1.3% of females encountered this or had reported a homosexual encounter within the past year. And yes, these differences are recognizable. 2%, 2.7%, 1.3% are not the same, but the percentage rates of homosexual activity, for both males and females, are not that far off. What we have found, though, which is really important in sexual activity, is the culture that people are coming from. There are some cultures where sexual activity, sexual promiscuity are really pushed, encouraged within that culture. And when those norms, those standards are pushed, the rate of sexual activity, the rate of sexual partners, I guess the number of sexual partners, dramatically increases for people from these cultures. There's other cultures where sexual activity is almost non-existent. There's specific Eskimo cultures where sexual activity is kind of seen as a childish thing and laughed at as if it's comical. And in those cultures, very few people engage in any type of sexual activity once they reach adulthood, unless it's for really the procreation or for the ability to kind of produce new children. And this relates to something that we talk about in this field called sexual scripts, the kind of learned concepts of how sex should happen, how sex should be approached within the culture. And there's a belief that many men and women, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their sexual identity or gender identity, kind of feel pushed to abide by. So you not only recognize which gender you are, you not only recognize which gender you're interested in, but you recognize kind of what's appropriate for you as a person within your culture based on your gender and all of the other things surrounding it that kind of dictates how sexual you are or kind of which sexual activities you're going to most likely engage in. Now there is some kind of uncertainty as whether or not sexual scripts are the only thing that dictates our sexual preferences and our sexual behavior, but it's very difficult when we look at different cultures to deny the fact that your environment plays a much larger role than your sex when we talk about kind of the different sexual activities and preferences that we see between men and women. Of course, when we start talking about this idea of sexual development, we're kind of compelled as psychologists to talk about one of the first theorists that ever talked about this notion of sexual development at all. And that was, of course, the very famous psychologist Sigmund Freud, who argued in his early work that all people are sexual beings, not only when they reach adulthood, but from the moment of birth. He talked about this thing called libido, or psychosexual energy, that really pushed us to seek gratification even when our gratification wasn't derived through our traditional sex organs. He talked about different stages of psychosexual development that he thought really impacted not only our kind of gratification that we link to sexual identity, but kind of quirky behaviors that we develop throughout our our lives. He talked about this idea of something called the oral stage, which happened for the first 18 months of our lives, where we derived tons of sexual gratification through stimulating our mouth and kind of searching out the environment by chewing and biting and sucking on everything that we could possibly cram into our mouths. And he argued that, if these needs are met, all things are great, but if they're not met and they're in the 18 months of our growth, then we actually have different, what he called fixations, that start to develop. So we start to over smoke, or we start to overeat, or we start to develop whatever quirk we find to kind of sate or allow us to kind of fulfill those oral needs that we weren't able to meet as children. And he talked about different stages of development throughout the entire lifespan that kind of pop up, or I guess, actually the entire lifespan, that pop up that cause different types of disturbances, different types of sexual anomalies that come around. This idea was really interesting, and a lot of people were attracted to it, and in fact we still use some of the terms that Freud introduced unknowingly today. If you've ever described yourself as exceptionally anal, you're probably referring to your need to have everything organized or everything neat, and that actually came straight from Freud's idea of psychosexual development. Essentially, you're saying, when you say you're anal, that you didn't get potty trained correctly, so you've got these residual effects that make you want to kind of have everything neat and orderly now. But, that's pretty much all we've done with Freud's theory since then. Almost all research has suggested that his idea of psychosexual stages of development make no sense whatsoever when we look at it statistically. There's also no research to support his most controversial stage that he talked about, called the phallic stage, where he argued that almost all females at this point in time are kind of tarnished for life, because they recognize at this point that males have these amazing genitals called a penis that they will never have. And he argued that a lot of times they just are constantly upset over that, and they develop what's called penis envy, and males are constantly worried and trying to be hyper masculine during this stage because they're worried about something called castration fear. Well, since Freud's ideas were produced, and many people started studying the topic of sexual identity and sexual development after he introduced his ideas, almost all research has shown that, again, there is no evidence for this particular theory. And in fact, there's no evidence for many of Freud's theories that he produced. But it is worth noting that this was where some of the early research in sexual development started. And once we started actually being more scientific about it, coming up with credible research, we found that sexual development, just like gender development, actually undergoes quite the process.